Folks, welcome back in. Good to have you with us, and a good morning to you. It's coming up to 11:05 at Boston's talk station WRKO. Mike Siegel here as we get started for a big hour. And, it's been very frustrating over the years to watch what's happened in the Middle East and the homicide bombings in Israel, killing of innocent children. I remember one Sbarro pizza place was blown up. 15 kids died thanks to a homicide bomber. And we've heard all of these attacks. And, of course, most recently, here in the United States, 9/11, we had the World Trade Center taken down. And tragically here in Boston, we had, of course, that terrible terrorist attack a little over a week ago now. And in all of that, going back even to 93 and the attack on the World Trade Center at that time, when have we heard moderate Islamic followers, people of the Islamic faith, condemn the violence and the taking of their religion by the extremists who use the Muslim religion as the basis for their carrying out their horrible, murderous acts? And the answer is we don't hear very much, do we? Well, searching high and wide, we found a gentleman who's of great stature, who is of the Islamic faith, and who is outraged regarding the attacks that we've seen on human life, terrorist attacks, whether it was Tanzania and Kenya at our embassies, many of the other attacks around the world. And he doesn't like the fact that we have these attacks taking place allegedly in the name of Islam. His name is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Dr. Jasser is the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. He is actually also a former lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy and a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And delighted to have him with us on the program. Dr. Jasser, I thank you for being with us. How are you today?
Great. It's nice to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Pleasure. You've also done a book, of course, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, An American Muslim's Patriot's Fight to Save His Faith. What do you believe by the title of that book is necessary to save your faith of Islam?
Well, I think I look at why my parents came here and why I wanted to join the Navy and give back to this country is that this country had a formula, an experiment that has worked better than any place in the world. It's a separation of church and state that allows religious freedom, celebrates religious freedom, but yet is not a theocracy, does not have any flavor of one specific religion, but rather uses reason. And our Constitution and Bill of Rights, I think, is the best example in the world. But if you look in the Middle East, you now had two choices. Both are each worse than the other. One is Arab fascism of Mubarak or Bashar Assad in Syria, or the Saddam Hussein that we had to get rid of, or the theocracy of now we see the Brotherhood in Egypt, the Brotherhood in Tunisia, the Islamists, Khomeinists in Iran, where they think that our religion should be the government. And that battle between, in the Muslim mindset, between secularism or freedom versus theocracy is just now starting to be waged. And I think Muslims can have a third path. They don't need to choose between those two fascisms. And my family certainly came here to celebrate that. And terrorism is one symptom of that underlying problem. It is a manifestation of an ideology that believes that the West is anti-Islam, anti-Muslim. That's part of the radicalization process, is to tell Muslims that this society is against them, that freedom is against them, that the imams need to run government. And slowly, the last step is what we've been working on, which is the whack-a-mole program. And that's not going to work. We need to find Muslims, and our organization is about owning up that we have to we own this problem, we have to fix it. It may not be a majority, it's a minor minority that end up becoming militant, but that militancy is coming out of a pool of ideology of political Islam that we need to take to reform.
Well said. Dr. Jasser is with us. He is Muslim, and he is moderate. He's reasonable. We hear a lot about the radicals who are unreasonable, who are violent, who are terrorists. Now we've got a guy from the background of Islamic belief and Islamic faith who obviously is on the same page as most of us are. Where did your family come from? What country in the Middle East?
From Syria. My grandfather, Zuhdi Jasser, was a businessman in the 30s and 40s, and then wrote for one of the largest newspapers in Syria. And when the Ba'athists took over in the late 50s and early 60s, he was in and out of house arrest, lost everything as they nationalized and socialized everything like happened with other fascist regimes in Europe before World War II. The Ba'athists were the same, and that brought Assad to power. My dad also was trying to fight for democracy there and ended up having to escape into the mountains of Lebanon and waited to come here. So my parents are both from Syria. And we see now, most of us American Syrians were telling everybody we could tell when the revolution started that it's not going to be like Egypt, that it's going to be one of the bloodiest things this world has ever seen in a century because that government is ruthless. It believes it owns that country, and it looks at its own people as being slaves and chattel, and that can be run over with tanks, and it'll continue that way until, the forces of good get some help there.
Well, I remember when Bashir al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, was running Syria in the way you just described as a dictator. There was a small piece in the newspaper. We don't get the big pieces when apparently when Islamic fundamentalists carry out barbaric acts against their own people in the way we would with other countries like Israel, who don't do those acts, but somehow the things they do to defend themselves get represented as being some sort of horror. This was just a small piece about the former late president of Syria, Hafez al-Assad, when he used his brother, who was head of the military, to wipe out an entire village of 25,000 people because they were of a different religious sect, and Assad feared them. And in order to keep control, he literally wiped out the village. Didn't get much attention, but that's the sort of thing that was going on in Syria.
Yeah, I remember my father in 1982 when Hama was wiped out, like you said, throwing the Newsweek across the room and saying, I can't believe this is on page 23. We just lost family members. You had a town that was wiped out in 6 days with tanks that drove through. They used the Brotherhood as the reason to do that because the Brotherhood was the most organized there. And, one of the things I hope people understand, if you look at the ascension now, the Muslim Brotherhood, I mean, my life's work has been focused on defeating the Muslim Brotherhood and their ideas. However, if you look at where they got their fuel, these dictators created these Islamist groups, helped fuel them so that they could put them up as the reason for needing dictatorship. And if you want to defeat political Islam and, the clerics and their ideas, you defeat bad ideas with good ideas. When you repress them with tanks and bullets and guns and military oppression, it fuels them. The Brotherhood became as big as it is in Egypt because of all the martyrdom that they were given by the dictators from Jamal Abdel Nasser on. The Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia that are now fueling radical Islam around the world had been fueled by a royal family that runs that country like an autocracy and uses the conservative far-right Wahhabis as an excuse in which to destroy its own population. And you see this sort of marriage of evils across the Middle East, and lost in the middle has been no liberal Islam, no moderate Islam, which is really what was killed in Hama and killed in so many cities, with radical Islam being the excuse and the head of it.
Well, and that's part of the problem. We're talking, by the way, folks, with a gentleman who is Islamic and who is moderate and who wants to eliminate the radical Islamic fundamentalists who commit violence, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. All right, Dr. Jasser, let's talk about the Islamic fundamentalist movement. Those who, like bin Laden, and I've said this many times, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri at Al-Qaeda, and some, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in Iran, and these leaders of the Islamic fundamentalist jihadist movement, are they correct in their interpretation of the Quran that using this violence against the non-believers is appropriate and justified?
Absolutely not. And this is why, My book at the end, I have a whole chapter about how we as Muslims, whether you're lay Muslims, scholar Muslims, or imams or clerics, the most important thing we can do is begin to reinterpret Quranic passages. Just because there's one passage that talks about just war against a tribe in 615 AD, that where Muslims were going to be wiped out by a pagan tribe, and they said, slay them where you find them. In the Quran, for example, our American military said slay the Taliban where you find them in Afghanistan, and that was a very moral thing for our generals to be saying because they were, housing bin Laden and declared war on us. Same thing in Iraq. So just war is just war. The problem with the Islamists is the Quran was given to Muslims in the 7th century at a time where there was no separation of church or mosque and state anywhere in the world. And part of what made America successful is this evolution in which Christendom determined that render unto Caesar what is Caesar and unto God's what is God's is the best type of government. And then you dissociate belonging to a faith to belonging to a state. And that is the problem with jihadists. Jihadists believe that since the Islamic State exists, they have a military obligation as citizens of that state to fight and kill enemies, quote-unquote, of Islam. And that's how radicalization happens, and that's why our organization's main mission statement is the separation of mosque and state. Once you do that, you inoculate Muslims against radicalization.
All right, but let me get to the question about Sharia law, because what we understand as non-Muslim followers of this problem is that Sharia law will tell you that it is, in fact, a combination of the politics and the religion, that Iran, for example, as a Muslim state, is the way Sharia law wants it to be. Afghanistan under the Taliban, same thing. And that you do not separate those, and that those who do not follow Sharia law are going to be punished. That's our understanding, Dr. Jasser. What is the reality about that?
The reality, I think, is actually simpler than you think. If you look at my Twitter feed, a number of these Islamists across the country just in the past few days have been saying, Dr. Jasser, you don't know what you're talking about. Sharia has to be part of government in Muslim-majority country, et cetera, et cetera. And my response to them, simple, short responses. Sharia is God's law in Arabic, and when it's enacted by man, it's no longer God's law. It becomes man's law. They can call it Sharia if they want, but that's not God's law. That becomes the law of the clerics who impose their interpretation of religion upon us. So, yes, I might use Sharia in my own personal life at home with my marriage contract with my wife, my last will and testament, my dietary restrictions, my prayer and fasting, but I don't want Sharia in government, because once you empower Sharia in government, you've lost the ability to use reason to argue law, and you have to use exegesis. And the West went through this when we no longer use canon law in government, and we went to a system based in reason that anybody could have access to, and not just the priests and the clergy. And it's pretty simple. It's not Sharia when it's in government. It's man's law, because we're interpreting things based on Scripture.
But of course, you understand now that we're hearing people say that maybe we should not have Islamic followers coming into this country, because by definition, they are inconsistent with America, where there is, as you pointed out, under the First Amendment, freedom of religion. And therefore, if people following Sharia or Islamic fundamentalists come into this country, by definition, they're going to want to change this country into what they define to be a country following Islamic fundamentalism, and that can't happen because our Constitution won't allow it, so maybe we shouldn't let them in at all. What do you say to that?
Well, I think you're touching on a number of things that's very important, which is why I wrote my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, is that we will lose this war if we think every Muslim believes in theocracy in the Islamic State. The solution has to come from within. Our biggest allies is we need to start taking sides within the House of Islam, those that believe in liberalism, that don't believe in the Islamic State and Sharia as government, but rather are more moderate and westernized, or modern in modernity rather, in their interpretation. So, that, yes, we need to have some ideological litmus tests on immigrants. We can't just sort of be blind and let our core philosophy, which makes America great, is the immigrant philosophy of welcoming everybody, be our suicide pact too, and that we have to be discerning of who comes in. But it's not about them being Muslim. It's about them being Islamist, believing that the political system should be a theocracy based in Islamic law. Just like when we were in the Cold War, if we were having people coming from the Soviet Union, coming from Vietnam or other areas where the Soviets were heavy, or even, non-Soviet areas, we would look at whether they were related to the Communist Party and things. We didn't outlaw the Communist Party, but yet their ideology was important to know.
We'll come right back with Dr. Jasser. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a gentleman here who is, in fact, a follower of Islam, a religious man who, as you've been hearing for the last 15 minutes, is able to separate his religious belief from government just as most of us do, and that we do not need to have Sharia law imposed on a government under Islam if you follow Islam as he does. The question is, who's going to win the battle? Our number to Boston, if you want to talk with Dr. Jasser, who's here with us, and this is a golden opportunity for you to talk with someone of the Islamic faith who believes, as you do, that there ought to be separation of church and state, and there need not be violence in the name of a religion. In this case, Islam. Our number is 617-266-6868, 617-266-6868. Mike Siegel in, good to have you with us. It's 11:21. We come back with Dr. Jasser and your calls at Boston's talk station, WRKO. Okay, folks, we're back at it. Good to be here with you. 11:24, Mike Siegel at Boston's talk station, WRKO. We go back with Dr. Jasser, who is an Islamic follower, a man of religious faith, who doesn't believe Sharia law has to be imposed, rejects violence on the part of Islamic fundamentalists, jihadists, and does not believe that the Koran instigates violence against people. Let's go to Richard for Dr. Jasser. Richard, you're on Boston's talk station, WRKO. Hello.
Hey, guys. Dr. Jasper, it's nice to speak with you.
Thank you.
Listen, I'll try to be as succinct as I can. I hear this, what you're saying, from a lot of individual, Muslims and such, where they say that they don't, believe that violence should be, in the name of their faith, should be directed on individuals, and things like that, and how, and you'll quote various portions of the Quran that'll say that, to kill one is to kill, as if you had killed all of humanity. And I'm sympathetic to your position where, the idea that Sharia, if you're going to practice Sharia within your individual faith, that's your decision, but that you believe that it shouldn't be imposed upon society as a whole, as sort of a political structure. But I guess the challenge, and I think maybe you would agree with me, is that no major school of Islamic jurisprudence adheres to that. In fact, it's the opposite, that Sharia should be all-encompassing. The Quran, the Sunnah, and the Hadiths make up, the body of Sharia, and we're talking about the unalterable literal Word of God. So, what do you say to somebody that says, theologically speaking, we're talking about the little Word of God? Who are you to say what, the limits of Sharia should be if we're saying that this is what all the Islamic schools of jurisprudence say it is?
All right, thank you for the call. Go right ahead, Dr. Jasser.
Well, thank you. And again, I don't come up with these ideas as I talk about in my book. They didn't come out of the thin air for me. There's a number of scholars that I cite that my father and grandfather, who was a Sharia court judge, and so many others, scholars in Islamic history that, for example, Abdullah Naim, an Emory professor, has talked about Islam and the secular state. You're right. The four schools of thought in Sunni Islam are problematic. They all basically still have not abandoned death to apostates and second-class citizens for second-class status for women and their ability to manage their own affairs and vote, etc. All these things need reform. That's why, one of the more controversial things I talk about is they need to develop a new madhab or a new school of thought, which is modern, which is related to driven by the separation of mosque and state. But they view that as heresy. You're right. But that's going to happen later. I'm not going to be able to lead that. What can be led, though, if you look in Europe, what led to the ultimate Reformation and modernization of Christianity? It was the business community, the regular community that drove government, deists, if you will, that said, we don't want theocrats running the show. So I think that's what regular Muslims can do. The intellectual Muslims that, I tangle with imams all the time. But we have to wake up our government in this country to say, listen, radicalization is a Muslim problem that needs a Muslim solution. And I'm recognizing that. I'm not apologizing for it. I think we need to fix it. And the first few steps of radicalization is the belief in the Islamic State and these concepts that you mentioned that we need to acknowledge as being problematic.
Let's go to Fred. You're on with Mike Siegel and our guest, Dr. Jasser at WRKO. Fred, hello.
Well, yes, thank you. I think that Dr. Jasser is a very brave individual. I'm wondering whether he's received threats from a number of believers in Islam, or because I've read somewhere that they call him like an Uncle Tom.
Thank you for the call, Dr. Jasser. Are you getting threats yourself?
I had gotten a threat until last January after the Al-Qaeda activists in Syria started to notice who was helping the American Syrian opposition. And I did get a threat from Al-Qaeda in the Middle East. But, yeah, the Islamists, you'll find, if you search Uncle Tom and Jasser, you'll find Facebook pages about it. The Islamists on Twitter, for example, just in the past few days since I've been speaking up critical of some of the Boston community about the ideas that I feel radicalize Muslims there, they don't want to engage me on the ideas. They'd much rather, and I think that shows that this can be won. If they have such a great idea in political Islam and my idea of liberalism and secularism is so bad, then they should be able to engage the idea. But instead, when I get on Fox or CNN and debate them, they spend the whole time calling me names and saying I'm not qualified and dismissing me, when in fact the American tradition is to prove that I'm wrong by the weight or merit or dismerit of my ideas. And they don't want to do that, so they call names.
Laurie, you're on with Dr. Jasser at WRKO. Good morning, Laurie.
How you doing? I study world religion, and I believe as an intelligent person, you can separate church and state. And if you're intelligent, you won't use violence. And I believe in what the doctor's trying to say, and he's trying to change the way of people thinking of different cultures. What is America about? We're a melting pot. We're every kind of nation and religion. We have to respect people's gods. Everybody has a god, and it be a refrigerator or spirituality. So if you don't impose violence on somebody and you are a productive person in society, you can have your own religion. That's what I believe in.
All right,
Absolutely.
Dr. Jasser, go ahead.
And amen. And I would tell you, and I would ask you to engage your Muslim colleagues that you know about this. If they agree with you, tell them to help our organization and go to aifdemocracy.org. I did a panel in Iowa. I speak across the country and across the world, and I did a panel and engaged the largest mosque there, which is one of the oldest mosques in the country. And the head of the mosque stood up after my speech where I said what I've been telling you. He said, well, Dr. Jasser doesn't know what he's talking about, and you can't separate mosque and state in Islam because the Prophet was the head of a military, head of state, and the head of the faith community. So I said, listen, we've evolved since then. Just like you use science, you can use political science to evolve into new ideas, and we're not imprisoned into what was happening in 620 AD. And these ideas, were dismissed. And I think a lot of the people in that community listened to them and said, oh my gosh, we've been doing all this interfaith work for 20 years with these people, and we didn't realize that they don't even buy into the First Amendment and they say, well, we follow the First Amendment because we believe in the law of the land, but if Muslims were a majority, we'd want an Islamic state. That creates a split identity, a schizophrenia for our youth, in that they feel that they should have a different government if they're a majority, and that's what radicalizes our community.
Final call, Gene. You're on WRKO with Dr. Jasser. Go right ahead, Gene.
I applaud your courage, Doctor. I wanted to know what your take is on the fact that our government, and especially our president, will not recognize Islamic radicalism for what it is. I think we have to accept that and fight it properly. But what is your take on that?
Well, you're 100% right, and this is the issue. It's not only our president; it's political correctness in society. The use of Muslims for partisan battles, where one side says that, they're the minority, we're protecting, they're the victims, and the other side, sometimes will also say, well, every Muslim's a possible terrorist, etc. And in the meantime, solving the problem is not really on the agenda because it's just sort of a partisan left and right issue. And our organization has, feminists and conservatives and all working together, not about the issues we disagree on, but on the fact that we agree on one thing, which is the U.S. Constitution needs to be protected, and Islamism as an ideology needs to be defeated with Muslims leading it, but we need Americans to start to be engaging in the debate and using terms like jihad and Islamism and not being afraid to and being shut up with free speech issues about being told they're Islamophobes or bigots just because they're having the debate.
Well, final point, Dr. Jasser, we have 1.57 billion members of the Islamic faith on this planet. If, in fact, the 99% who are moderate people like yourself spoke out, this problem might go away. Why is it that most moderates are not like you and sit back and allow people in their own religion to steal their religion and to use it in the form of violence without condemning them and getting them shut down?
Well, because the way you set up the question, I disagree with. The 0.1% are the ones that would ever use violence to kill innocents and target, people in a marathon. But the pool from which that 0.1% comes from, those that believe in the Islamic State, that believe in political Islam, that really don't like the West, really come here just for economic reasons and not for political ones, I believe that can be 30, 40%. I mean, if you look in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood won an election. Now, they only got 25% of the vote, and then they won a runoff against the fascists of Mubarak. So there really wasn't much of a choice there for the Egyptian people, and I think they're going to have Revolution 2.0 and 3.0 yet. But we have to realize that political Islam, this ideology with the schools of thought that dominate, as the other questioner asked before, that is a major problem within the Islamic organized community. And the problem is those of us with the knowledge to fight them are a minority within the secularist and the the non-activist Muslims. So it needs quite a bit of momentum to take on an organized faith community that's run by, supremacists that believe in the Islamic State.
Well, let's hope that you're successful and win that battle and draw more and more people to your point of view. Dr. Jasser, thank you, and it's great to talk to you this morning.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it very much. Number to Boston, if you want to continue, folks, with your own thoughts about this problem, 617-266-6868. Why is it that we can't get more like Dr. Jasser from the Islamic faith to come out and condemn the violence? He's making that point. Good to have you with us. Your calls are next at 11:35 at Boston's talk station, WRKO.